Hi again, everybody. We're here now with our audience and some questions from one of the students in the distance learning course. And I guess I'm going to start with the students' questions, and then we're going to go to our audience. So these are, of course, to our guest, Steve Keen. And I'm just going to read them so you get the questions exactly as they're being asked. So this is from Warren Farr. He says, Mike R., thanks for the opportunity to ask questions of Steve Keen. Although I'm not familiar with Steve's work, we haven't gotten that far in the course yet, that's why. I have said that he is the Mike Radzicki of Australia. So here are some questions that I would like to ask of either of you, and we'll direct them to you. So the first one is, after the Second World War, economic policymakers took a more proactive approach to guiding the economy as a result of perceived policy success. In your opinion, has policy based on modern economic thought had a positive impact on economic well-being?
I think the policies that were set in place at the end of the Second World War had some positive impact, but they were half-baked. So, for example, the major policy innovation was the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was supposed to try to get away from all the chaos that occurred, not just with the between the Great Depression and so on, but even the stuff during the 1920s. So it was a way of forcing economies to have to try to have a balanced trade portfolio. But what Keynes wanted to have in that system was to have a new currency being devised for international trade and pressure not just on deficit countries to deflate their economies and thereby bring their trade back into balance, but to have surplus economies pushed to reflate and therefore increase the demand for imports and bring them into balance. And that didn't happen because the American economy became the reserve currency and there were no limits on surplus nations. Now, I think that set up a whole range of momentum in the system that meant we ultimately got to the stage of the breakdown of that system and the chaos we've got into since then. We also had at the same time a total horrific reaction to what happened with the Great Depression, with masses of people being out of work, and that then leading, of course, to what happened with Germany and the Second World War. So our grandparents, in many ways now, went through an awful period in human history and pretty much said never again. And a large part of that was saying we could never let mass unemployment occur once more. Now, if I go from my own country, there's a thing called the White Paper on Employment, published in 1945. And that has a phrase which I remember very clearly, pardon the modern sexism, but it says, the aim of economic policy is to maintain such a pressure on employment that there will always be a shortage of men rather than a shortage of jobs. Now, of course, that can be done to the stage which Milton Friedman parodied, to say you're trying to drive employment below what he called the natural rate. There is no such thing as a natural rate, but you can try to drive the economy far too hard, and yes, you will cause imbalances that way. And we then had a breakdown in policy over time. So I think our initial starting point in an institutional sense was half good. The emphasis we had on avoiding mass unemployment and the social problems that causes was also very good, but we set it up in such a sense that it virtually had to break down. Even without the neoclassical critique of Keynesian policies, those policies would have broken down given the foundation they started from. The other essential thing which people tend to forget about the aftermath of the Second World War and the Great Depression, and I see this as essential coming from Minsky's point of view, is that that experience drove debt levels down to almost zero. So if you look at debt as the accumulator that causes trouble in capitalism, debt was virtually at zero when the Second World War came to an end, private debt, and that let us start again even without policy. So I see those three things as being why it started well, and all three, again, is why ultimately we got to a stage of breakdown.
Okay. Second question from Warren. If economic policy can have an impact on economic well-being, then what are the most promising, highest leverage policy areas to be considered? And I guess that would be currently going forward. Okay.
Well, the thing I'd most like to do, I think, is almost impossible to achieve. And that is, I think, that a large part of capitalism's problems emanate from the secondary market for assets. If you look at the levels of debt we've got now, we've got into those levels of debt because corporations and speculators speculating on the values of shares, and individuals and corporations speculating on the value of houses. And that's encouraged people to accumulate large amounts of debt simply based on the expectation that the prices are going to rise indefinitely. And that's where a large part of the borrowing has come from that's got us into, I think, a similar situation that it applied prior to the Great Depression. So the reform I would like to see is some set of reforms, and I say some set because I don't have a precise blueprint, some set of reforms that eliminated the attraction of speculating on the secondary market for assets. Now, everything I see about things like putting in a Tobin tax and things like that are ways of doing it which I'm almost certain would be, if we brought them into effect, we'd bring them into effect after a crisis. They'd have some effect after we got ourselves into trouble, and once the economy stabilised as a result of those policies, there'd then be pressure to remove these terrible obstructions to efficient operation of capitalism. We'd be back in the same old situation again. So the thing I'd most like to see is a reform of the way in which we buy and sell capital assets. I have one idea from shares. This is taken from a colleague of mine who's a systems engineer, Trun Andresen, and that is to have time-limited shares. So rather than shares having an eternal life, a share would be issued with a 25-year life, let's say, and you'd buy it for $1. That would be its list price when it was issued. The IPO would be $1, and 25 years later, it would be bought back by the company for $1. So in the meantime, it might rise or fall depending upon potential dividend yields, but there would always be the centre of gravity at both ends. And I think that alone could eliminate a huge amount of the speculation on shares, because you really would have to be worrying about what you think the dividend flow is going to be, rather than telling people that's what you're worrying about, but actually trying to do the game of old maid, as Keynes described in the general theory. And that, I think, is what attracts us to get into overwhelming levels of debt, and that then causes the crisis like we saw in the Great Depression, and I think we're going to see now. So institutional reform rather than policy.
Great. Great. And that's very much in harmony with the way a system dynamicist would look at it. The policies that change the structure of the system, the rules of the game, the institutions and so forth, change the behavior of the system. Third question by Warren. After reading some of the journals and papers provided by me in this macro class, it appears that dynamic feedback systems are a central and common theme. As a result, the modeling tools of system dynamics should be a powerful way to further explore macroeconomic issues. If this is true, then are system dynamics modeling tools being broadly adopted for this purpose? Why or why not?
I agree entirely with your supposition, and unfortunately they're not being used at all outside people like Mike and myself and a handful of others around the world. The reason is because these models actually undermine part of the myth of how the market operates that neoclassical economics works with. Whenever they try to dynamize their models, they get results they don't like. So they retreat from systems engineering, and only a handful of neoclassicals know anything about systems engineering, and most of that handful are on the fringe of the core of the profession. They're pretty close. They're closer to us than they are to the heart of the system. So it's a great tragedy it's not being used, and you can see two periods when economists tried to bring this in a big way. One was Phillips, and Phillips's work has been totally destroyed by the way it's been treated by conventional economists. But he was trying to bring in systems engineering back in the 50s, and then the sort of stuff that Mike is doing and I'm doing and so on are trying to bring it in now when the technology is so much better than what Phillips had to use back in the 1950s. So I'd like to think it can happen, but it involves getting people to think in terms of feedbacks, and ironically, most neoclassical economists don't think that way. If you look at what they call partial equilibrium analysis, where they have the ceteris paribus assumption, you can look at that from a feedback point of view and say that is assuming that there are no feedbacks outside the market itself. If you look at what they call general equilibrium, then that looks at feedbacks between markets, but that is always worked out on the basis that the feedbacks have worked their way down to zero. So that's when all the feedbacks have stopped. Now we need modelling that says the feedbacks are there all the time, and equilibria are unstable, and we have to look at a process out of equilibrium. You can do that with systems engineering, systems dynamics. It should be what macro starts to be about and goes on from there, but getting the profession to that point, it'll take a revolution.
Great. Okay, at this point, let's go to our audience, and we'll first start with Suleiman, and you have your first question for Steve Keen.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for inviting us. My first question is about Hyman Minsky. Could you tell us a little bit kind of sweeping overview of Minsky and theory and your current work also on Minsky?
Okay. Well, Hyman Minsky began from the point of view of seeing capitalism is cyclical and seeing the financial system as being the source of those cycles. So in a sense, he was one of Schumpeter's students as well, and as taught by Schumpeter, the emphasis was always you have to have a vision of how you think the system works and build from there. So his vision was the system is cyclical and finance plays a role in it. He then developed an explanation that involved Keynes in a fundamental way, and not Keynes of the ISLM Hicks model, but Keynes of the 1937 papers and the whole idea about a tendency towards euphoric expectations in capitalism. And the basic model that Minsky finally developed comes down to the following argument. First of all, we're in a cyclical economy, and we're in historical time. Therefore, if you look back in historical time, there will be a preceding incident in that time of some sort of financial crisis. And in the aftermath of that crisis, everyone, both borrowers and lenders, are going to be conservative about how much debt they want to get themselves into. If the economy has come through and survived that crisis nonetheless, then people who do leverage are going to come out ahead. The people who, because everybody's conservative, most projects that are put forward have cash flows that are going to recompense the debt, any debt they get into. Those who do more leverage are therefore going to get a better gain. They're going to get ahead, and people will realize that it pays to lever, which is one of Minsky's phrases. As a result of that, you have a drop in people's fears, risk premiums fall, and they then start to, A, get involved in more speculative investments, and B, they start to revalue capital assets, which they've suppressed the price of in the aftermath to the previous crisis. So you get a positive feedback occurring in terms of the level of investment, so the economy grows more rapidly, but you also get a positive feedback occurring in the price of capital assets. So as well as causing more investment and more endogenous growth in credit, money and output and so on, and confidence, you also get an endogenous growth in asset prices, which means you can speculate on asset prices and make a profit. So you get a takeoff in the whole system, which involves accelerating debt as people increase their leverage, and you get a group which Minsky calls Ponzi financiers, who can only make, who are paying such a price to get hold of the assets that the only way they can make money is by selling that asset on the rising market, because the commitments they get into to buy the assets, the cash flows from those investments exceeds their debt servicing costs. They keep on going for a while. You get a bubble in asset prices, then the system falters because of the servicing costs causing other businesses to find themselves becoming unfinancial. They sell their financial assets, that suppresses the growth in the price system, and you go into a crash where the very first people to go bankrupt are the Ponzi financiers. So you now go from one financial crisis to another financial crisis, and it's a causal chain which is entirely endogenous. Minsky then extends it to say, well, that's a model, a pure capitalist model without a government. What happens with the government sector? And he says when you have big government with the government sector, the government then will, because of counter-cyclical spending, will actually be providing a cash flow to businesses which they wouldn't otherwise have during a downturn. So that acts as a sort of homeostatic stabilizer and brings the economy back into balance again, but the cycles will continue. And also, the lender of last resort actions by the Reserve Bank can stop the system going into a financial breakdown of the monetary system. Actually, looking at where we've got to now, I think Minsky can be seen as an optimist, because I think given these defences of big government and the lender of last resort facility, we've simply had the speculation pushed to an even greater level than it was during the Great Depression. And the level of debt now, recorded private debt in America, if you look at what Fisher said it was before the Great Depression, it's 2.5 to 3 times what it was before the Great Depression occurred. So we may have got ourselves into a more extreme situation because of that structural issue about making money out of speculation on the secondary market and in assets. So that's Minsky's vision of an internal feedback system, all very much expressible in systems terms. And what I'm trying to do is to make that complete elaborate model and then include some of the aspects that Minsky couldn't put in without the mathematics, such as the positive feedback loop on asset prices, and see whether I can then calibrate it to the behaviour of our modern economy. And I expect that I can, and that's not going to be a good thing.
Thank you.
Okay, now we'll ask Jairo Parata to ask a question.
Yes, going back to your book, in the developing nation, and specifically in Latin American, there seems to be a trend going on against this kind of orthodox economic policies. Different governments and different countries seems to be looking for alternative economic policies. But you can see a contradiction, even though that's a reality. Still, in the economic programs, I would say 90% of the economic education is based on orthodox and neoclassical textbooks. So you find this situation that even though there is a reality demanding or searching for alternative economic models, what you learn in school is basically the same pro-market policy that it seems to be in Latin America. They have failed because the only success they can show is they have been able to lower inflation, but the level of unemployment and informality in the labor market are terrible. So what you're feeling about, why is the case if in your book you show that neoclassical theory is not logical, is not mathematically proven, basic, oriented, why is the case still being teaching so strongly especially on the undergrad classes?
Well, it's probably because, as I said, neoclassical economists don't respect protests from the outside. I think this is where analysis of methodology makes a fair bit of sense, and Kuhn's idea of paradigms is important, but probably for economics, Lakatos makes more sense, where he talks about scientific research programs having a hard core of belief and then a protective belt around that they'll adjust to try to stop criticism coming in. And when we are saying that neoclassical economics is wrong, we are attacking the hard core. And their response to that is to adjust the protective belt, so Milton Friedman's assumptions don't matter nonsense argument fits in that protective belt to stop students criticizing it. And they are forever readjusting what's in the core in some ways as well to hang on to the basic idea of Marxist markets as self-equilibrating and so on. So they are locking out the alternative way of thinking. But at the same time, to actually have an alternative, you have to have an alternative. And what we have at the moment is criticism of the conventional view. But we don't have that cohesive, paradigmatic engine to bring into economics. I think systems theory is part of that, but it's not the whole thing. You have to have that sense of a vision, which is why I'm trying to combine, as I do, Marx and Schumpeter and Keynes, because I think in that you do have a completely different philosophical core that can give you that very much hard core correlated together. And I would then hope that if we can construct that, we won't behave in the same way the neoclassicals have of denying empirical reality, which is the greatest sin I think they commit. So partly why the schools continue doing it is A, because they lock out alternatives in the first instance, but secondly because there isn't a cohesive alternative to bring forward. And that's one reason why, despite all the requests I get to bring out a second edition of debunking and include the mathematics this time, why I'm saying no to that and saying what I want to do is just try to build the beginnings of a cohesive alternative paradigm. Of course, in doing that, I'm going to be drawing on a huge range of work being done by other people around the world, from the physicists across to the various non-orthodox economists whose views I like, such as, for example, the Circuitous School. I think has done a major job, Minsky, etc. But we have to build an alternative paradigm. And to some extent, that means dropping away from what I did with debunking economics, where I'm throwing stones at their glass house, to saying, okay, we're going to build our own shelter outside you, and then hopefully develop a core theory, a core system of value and so on, which can be built upon by our successors and finally build a rival to neoclassical thought. But it's going to be a long process. And maybe one of the best things we've got going for ourselves is the internet and the fact that people like Mike and I can put our stuff up there and make it accessible, so students who are being taught neoclassical stuff and want to see there's an alternative, they have far better access now to seeing what a different way of thinking might be than was possible during the days when Mike and I were young kids.
Long time ago. All right, last. Suleiman, you have one more question for Steve Keen.
Yes, I have one more. My second question and last question is about the two emerging countries, I mean China and India, of course in an economic point of view, and I hope this could happen, and I think also in African countries, under, of course, on some circumstances, and taking into account historical and cultural aspects. Professor Keen, what do you think about the current economic model of China and India, and maybe talk a little bit about the social dynamics in fact?
Well, this is where I'm going to be saying myself as a commentator rather than an analyst. I don't know the economies as well as I would to be answer that question at the level I'd like to. But I was in China 27 years ago, and that gave me a feeling for the social dynamics underlying China. And I think both India and China do have an enormous amount of endogenous capacity to grow and to industrialize. So there is parts of their growth which will not be affected by what might ever happen with the external sectors. But having said that, China, when I was there, had a population of roughly 1 billion people. It's now 1.4 billion, I believe. And that is an enormous, absolutely enormous mass of people. And if you think about how you might direct that from the tops down, which is the way the Communist Party used to do it, then given the communication system it had, and the fact this communication came through the Communist Party, which had at the time 30 million members, so 3% of the population was a member of the Communist Party, they would formulate, there'd be a strong debate about what to do at the top level, the Politburo level, whatever the Chinese, I think they call it the same, and that would then be passed down through the structure as a slogan. And the slogan might be, for example, to promote grain. Now, the only way you could avoid being criticised within the structure was to carry that out to the letter. So when it got down to the level of the commune, you would then rip up legume fields and plant wheat. 9 months to a year later, the next bunch of babies starts to be born. You haven't got enough protein for them, and the kids start to suffer from quarkajor. The peasants put up with it for 3 to 6 months. They then blow their stacks, justifiably, go and slaughter the local Communist Party branches in 1 or 2 parts of the provinces. That inverts the whole thing. The information goes back up through the chain back to the Politburo, saying promote legumes, which then happens, and it comes down as a slogan. At the base level, they rip up wheat fields and plant legumes, and then the next time around, the kids starve. And on goes the whole thing. Now, I'm not putting this as far as a parody, because I saw, we went to some parts of Sichuan, and looking at the children that I saw there, I said to the journalist I was with, there's something wrong with those kids' faces. I think they're suffering protein deficiency, and sure enough, they were. That's what was the local disease. Then we went to Shanghai, and we met with the mayor of Shanghai and the guy who was introduced to us quite literally as the economic boss of Shanghai. That was his title. And we asked them to explain a piece of information we'd got everywhere before we left, which was quite incongruous to us, and that was that China's output of light industry had grown 17.1% previous year, but the output of heavy industry had fallen by 6.7%. Now, you need light industry to make heavy and vice versa. It was incongruous. One went up so much and the other went down. And we'd ask everywhere we went, why did this happen? And without fail, the explanation we got back then, which is one reason why I'm very glad to see the change in China, explanation began with, we followed the directives of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And that basically said, we did what we were told, so you can't criticise us, because if we criticise you, end up being shot. So that we did that. And we'd say, yes, but what does that mean? Well, the economic boss finally gave us the actual explanation. He said, well, the Communist Party sent us a directive to promote light industry. Yeah, so we asked, so what did you do? Quote, unquote, translated, of course, but this is a quote. We stripped heavy industry factories and turned them into light industry. Now, that's insane. That part of the dynamic is why China wouldn't grow under the socialist experiment. With the capitalist experiment, yes, they're growing willy-nilly. But at the same time, that same mad dive into one thing as a solution to everything seems to be part of the nature of this, whether it's China or there's the sheer gigantic scale of the country. So they're now industrializing at an enormous rate, and what are they ignoring? One thing which physics teaches is about entropy. They're generating an enormous amount of waste. And I haven't been back to China for 27 years, but I am looking forward one of these days to going back there and seeing what it's like. And I think I might take an oxygen cylinder with me, because I've got a feeling their crisis is going to come out of pollution. It seems to be happening in some parts of the provinces already. This is another systems feedback that's been ignored, and economists are guilty of ignoring. Even systems engineers largely don't include the entropic feedback from economic processes. So I think that's another great tragedy. If India and China ever were to industrialise to the scale of living that Americans are used to and Europeans expect, then the pollution load on the economy would be even more overwhelming than what we've already got. So I think the timing, unfortunately, for their industrialisation after the colonial period may lead us into another crisis, and they will be suffering from what they're trying to achieve. So I'm, unfortunately, to end with a Chinese quote, I think we really do live in interesting times. And the ones who are going to most experience that initially may well be the Indians, given the nature of the Indian Delta system. So it's something which has to happen. If we could grow without looking at the physical constraints, then I could see them growing quite successfully and becoming the industrial powers of the 21st century. But given that the 21st century is starting in an environmental crisis caused by the economic growth of the 20th century, then I think we're in for some pretty dangerous consequences.
Okay, at this point I think it's good to wrap up. We've been at this quite some time, and but I think it was very interesting and profitable. I'd like to thank Suleiman Ba and Jairo Parata, and of course Steve Keen, who is on a whirlwind tour of the United States right now. I'm not sure if you know what time zone you're in right now, but we really appreciate you taking the time to spend a couple of days with us here at WPI, and I hope all of you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.